Right. That's a wonderful question to start with, really. Um, I'm not sure there is any sort of easy answer about a prescription, but I'll just say a couple of things about, the way I kind of encountered these various research fields. And I think the key thing is to sort of allow yourself to respond to whatever you see as the questions troubling you at any sort of given juncture within your research career. Right. So, when I sort of first began to think of doing research seriously, I had been teaching soon after my master's. I was, teaching undergraduate students. Um, these were sort of English literature courses in an undergraduate college in Bombay. And of course, there's also was a perception that literature teachers are not so useful, and therefore they were asked to do other kinds of teaching as well. So on the one hand, I did my sort of literature courses. The other kinds of teaching that were assigned to me was, an economic and social history of India that was supposed to be a foundation course for everybody, and nobody else wanted to teach it. So I considered it fortunate that it came to my sort of lot. And so, doing those two courses necessarily then forced you to, revisit many of the questions that you bothered you as a student, as a sort of, graduate student doing literature in a city like Bombay. Why is it that you don't study Indian languages? What is the connection? How does English, the world of English in our cities, in our urban settings, in our universities, how do they actually then structure the possibilities of studying the regional language literatures? Can curricula be sort of reformed? Can it be modified? What is the pedagogic sort of challenge there? All these were questions that, sort of were very inchoate and at the back of your mind as a student. And the literature curriculum did not allow you to, sort of ask these questions or even formulate them. But when you're on the other side of the sort of equation, as it were, these things are sort of staring you in the face. You have to face your students every single day, and you don't know the answer to these questions. So, that's when I think I began to sort of think seriously about the challenge of thinking about what bilingualism means. English as a high language, the vernaculars. And that, I think, was it was really the classroom. And, I could have sort of said, oh, but, my English literature background doesn't entirely equip me to study this. And that might have been the end of that research project or that research question. And you could have easily kind of gone and done something slightly more conventional that would have been considered slightly more easier and acceptable within an English literature department. But the challenge, I think, was to sort of not let the question die out, right? So you push the question, and then you don't know which universities to apply to for a sort of PhD. You kind of think of English literature departments even abroad. You know that you will not necessarily be able to kind of pursue what you want to do there. So it was through a sort of slightly longish process. I then decided that maybe the place to pursue this would be so as it would mean a shift from literature to the social sciences, a big shift. I was not trained in archival work. I didn't have a sort of background in social theory, any of that. So the willingness to sort of make take a blind leap of faith, as it were, and then things sort of working out. I think the same process has sort of repeated itself at different points in my research career. And that's why, from there, I went on to the related field of performance studies, from print, bilingualism, and performance studies. But then, having worked in a place like the Institute of Economic Growth now for 15 plus years, there's a way in which there's a lot that one sort of is surrounded by that one finds exciting, but there are times when you're also aware of the limitations, and you just feel that those questions need to be posed in different ways. And what I did before may not necessarily help me, but I have the skills to begin to think of those questions and sort of somewhere believe that you might stumble, but you might have the confidence to, frame those questions and the inquiries in innovative ways. I mean, I think that's where I would leave it. Right. I mean, the sort of employment and the nature of employment and the sort of, the relation of sort of short term, what's called circular migration, uh, in the Indian context is actually sort of, I mean, if you think of it, it 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 really is fairly unique. I mean, not just in South Asia. I think the levels, for example, of informal employment, uh, that is the percentage of the workforce that is dependent on sort of non-formal, non-secure, precarious, informal employment. India actually, for the last 15 or 20 years has, topped the league tables. So the dependence of the Indian economy on levels of, informal employment are amongst the highest in the world. Now, this is not something that we can really be proud of. The question remains as to then what are the kinds of sort of decisions within our planning process, which have kind of led to this situation, right? And this question actually first sort of hit me during the migrant workers crisis, during the lockdowns, because much as we saw disruptions and dislocation of workers and the disruption and the threat to livelihoods in all parts of the world, what we saw of the migrant workers exodus, the moment the lockdown was lifted in Indian, from Indian cities, that didn't play out anywhere else. Now, this clearly meant that the number of sort of people in Indian cities dependent on this very precarious nature of work, who basically believed and who knew that they didn't have a chance of sort of surviving in the cities, for even on a short term basis. So the moment the lockdown was lifted, they felt their chances of survival were much higher if they thought of sort of returning back to their villages, even in the midst of not having any means to do so. I mean, to think of that, I mean, that really sort of, starkly poses the scale of the problem. And, I mean, so if one says that this is a unique situation, it's peculiar to the Indian context. Commentators during the COVID lockdown, I mean, when they were faced with this spectacle that was unfolding of people literally walking on the highways, there's nothing else sort of, no traffic on the highways. It's just these sort of, hordes of people, processions with, meager belongings on their head, who were like in the scorching heat. Now, so, I mean, there were commentators who kept saying at this point, and it almost became something of a refrain, that the COVID pandemic had exposed the problem of the invisibility of informal workers to the policymakers. Now, this clearly is not something that you can take at face value. I mean, you cannot sort of, at no level, anybody familiar with life in the Indian cities would you actually believe that, policymakers were not aware. And, there's enough documentation. I mean, anybody who, knows the Indian economy, knows Indian urban life, knows the scale of dependence on sort of migrant labor on informal employment, right? So then where do you begin to sort of, how do you understand, the comment that, the invisibility was exposed for the first time? So clearly this is a blind spot that people are trying to sort of, pretend at one level as though this is something new. And that scale of sort of, in other words, it's the blindness, it's a chosen blindness. It's not invisibility, but you're sort of trying to sort of shut it off, right? So I began to sort of think about, what might have been the sort of uh, I mean, decisions not just with respect to labor, but also maybe the choices that Indian planners were making with respect to education that could have led to this kind of a situation, right? So the kinds of allocations and the decisions and the decision to prioritize higher education over sort of primary education for several decades after independence. This essentially meant that India was an exception in both the developing world and in the history of sort of development, if you think of developed nations at the comparable point of their development to India's current level of development. And the fact that Indian planners thought that they could bypass sort of a necessary commitment to develop primary education before you kind of think of building up higher education, access to higher education. This has essentially meant that for 5 decades, we were building up a sort of workforce that, the lower levels of the workforce were bound to be sort of, unskilled, semi-literate, poorly trained, and capable only of sort of seeking informal employment. So there you have the reason why, the scale of dependence on informal employment. And, it's a serious enough scenario that I think it requires other kinds of disciplines to point out the sort of refocus attention on this. Clearly, economists studying the problem or you leaving it entirely to them has not brought enough attention to this dimension of things, right? I think you put it very sharply, and the way you've posed the question actually sort of, I think, allows me to capture in very sort of shorthand form. The period that I was covering in that book, it was basically 1830 to 1880. 1880, for two sort of reasons to kind of put it in a nutshell. 1880 is the year the Congress gets set up. So there's a way in which, nationalism is seen as coming of age. But and related to that was something that is drilled to you as in your history classes right through school, especially growing up in Bombay, Western India. But I'm sure this also is in textbooks across the country, that Tilak, one of the things about his biography always in school textbooks is the fact that he starts these two newspapers, the Kesari in Marathi as a weekly, and the Maratha in English as a weekly, as a weekly, whereas the Kesari, was a daily, right? So now this is an interesting sort of, this fact is just given to you, and for the longest time you just kind of, it's you've memorized it, you kind of written answered questions in your exam and all of that. But it began to sort of strike me, what does it mean for the same person at the on the same day to kind of think of starting two separate newspapers? The frequency is different, the size of the newspaper is different, his own investment in he's not, he is invested, of course, to the extent that he is the person who kind of conceives this as necessary, but he is clearly sort of more involved in the sort of day-to-day management of the Kesari. That he kind of sees as, playing an extremely significant role. And he's writing frequently for the Kesari as well, Tilak. As against this, if you look at the first newspaper in Western India for Marathi, is 1832, Balshastri Jambekar starting a newspaper, the first newspaper, which he literally, the format is again not unusual to Western India, but the format is sort of symmetrically bilingual. He literally sort of says, what we will do is we will divide the page into two equal halves. One will be in English, one will be in Marathi. And, the invitation is for people to kind of send in their contributions either in English or in Marathi. And the claim is that we will translate it into the other language. Now, if you think of it, this 1830, you don't have a reading public in Bombay or in the Bombay Presidency which has equal amounts of English and Marathi. This empirically, historically, is simply not true. So this is an aspirational sort of reading public that he's literally positing. It's an imaginary reading public, right? And that is what the way he wants to see it. They want to see it that English and Marathi will be linked in a relationship of equality, right? So if that is the way he had imagined the bilingual relation the bilingual relation was imagined in 1830. By 1880, Tilak's action in starting two separate newspapers, in this very, the format is different, the frequency is different, the messages being put in, the content is completely different. This clearly signals that it is no longer possible to kind of actually say that the reading public, the idea of a symmetrical English Marathi reading public is, Tilak's action is clearly admitting and acknowledging that this does not exist, that these are two separate reading publics, right? So the question is then, that was the point where print tries to reach out to a larger audience with this kind of an idea. In 50 years' time, which is not such a long time, the whole untenability of that, that equality, that posited symmetrical relation is seen to be not possible and not available, right? So then it became a question of then sort of looking at the pattern of sort of press initiatives. What happens between 1830 and 1880? And, looking at that then gave me a way to kind of, plot the different sort of moments in the evolving relation of English and Marathi. And with that, of course, is related to the question of how the sphere of English educated intellectuals and, those students who kind of, do not have access to English education and sort of exit after sort of, say, school or high school without English, but with an education perhaps in Marathi or in Gujarati or, Kannada. These were the three languages of the Bombay Presidency. Okay, so then it's a question of, highly educated intellectuals and the lesser educated intellectuals. This is the English speaking sphere, this is the vernacular sphere. So that, the asymmetry and the hierarchy is evident there. So, through that period, how does that asymmetrical hierarchical relation between the two sections of the intelligentsia, how does that get structured and what does this mean politically? So that was what I think the book project was, the ways in which the book actually addressed the question of bilingualism. Work in progress, I'll quickly mention two things. One is, the current work that, relating to the migrant workers crisis is the question of sort of food security and migrant workers. I kind of began doing this in, through the pandemic, because the question of sort of portability of the drawing of rations, you know, began to be flagged by the government as something that they had already thought of to address the migrant workers crisis. But the more one kind of, sort of became aware of what the government was putting out at this point, you began to realize this was not just about food security, but it was, beginning to sort of tell you that, there had been sort of concerted and elaborate moves to put in place structures of sort of digital governance and the emergence of the digital state. There had been people who had been working on, the health insurance schemes, which were, digitally administered. Uh, and then, that there was also sort of work that had emerged around the employment guarantee scheme and the linking of that to the Aadhaar project and all of that. And now, the PDS, that is the public distribution scheme of sort of food security, was being linked to Aadhaar, and so on and so forth. So I think it's become evident to me that it's very important to kind of look at what the emergence of sort of digital governance and sort of the rethinking of social welfare architecture in India, and sort of bringing that completely under the purview of sort of the digital state. That I think, is a challenge that I'm trying to address through my work on food security. So that is work in progress, and again, it's linked to, migration. So I'm looking at the food security thing in terms of, three states that are sort of migrant sending states, three states that are migrant receiving states, and the way in which PDS and portability, is it really about, solving the migrant workers' needs and, those challenges, or is it really about something else? I mean, one's looking at, sort of both qualitative sources and quantitative sources, you know, for these three, for these 6 states. And very, very briefly, I'll just also allude to another sort of project that, has long been in the works, and it's going rather slow, but I'll mention it because I think it's very important. And this is to do with the translation of political economy texts in Marathi, in sort of mid 19th century Bombay. So Mill's sort of principles of political economy are getting rendered into Marathi. There are 3 versions of it that appear in quick succession between the very late, literally the early 50s to about 1856. And so I think, some of my earlier work on translation with respect to the theatre has kind of alerted me to the dynamics of, looking very carefully as to what happens in the name of translation. And the fact that these texts are sort of being taken up, of course, to produce pedagogic material. I mean, the immediate sort of challenge and the context is, producing material for use in the colonial classroom, maybe in Elphinstone College, for the BA course in sort of economics and history. Political economy was a part of the history courses. But in through that process, this is literally, I think, the earliest rendering of political economy texts in and modern economic thought into an Indian language. So that's work that I'm sort of hoping to carry forward in the next few years, in the coming years.